35,351. That is the number of Russian soldiers killed or wounded in a single month as Ukraine reclaimed nearly 50 square kilometers of its lost territory. Not since the early days of the invasion has the cost of every inch been so brutally tallied. That figure lands like a hammer, not in some distant spreadsheet, but in the battered fields and ruined villages of southeastern Ukraine, where the lines of control shift on the weight of each casualty. The world had grown used to a grinding, static front. Suddenly, the board flipped. Ukraine, battered and bloodied, is surging forward, liberating settlements that Russia thought untouchable. How did the nation so often written off as overmatched turn the tide in a war that was supposed to be lost by now? The answer is not what anyone predicted. For those who find themselves thinking about these questions long after the headlines fade, you are precisely the audience this work is made for. Subscribing here means you will see the next layer as it emerges, and your voice in the comments often shapes the conversation that matters most. Before the gray zones cleared and the liberation began, Russia had cultivated an illusion of control. Months of infiltration, small units sent behind Ukrainian lines, digging in and waiting for support, allowed the Kremlin to claim victories on maps that didn't match the ground truth. These gray zones were not true holdings, but propaganda fuel. Ambiguous spaces where neither side held clear authority, but Russia could broadcast claims of progress. Ukrainian villages became staging grounds for this distortion, with Russian troops hunkered down in shattered houses, waiting for orders that might never come. For 4 months, Russia's forces extended their reach by inches, each advance a thread in the story of inevitable conquest. The confidence in Moscow was palpable. The spring offensive, long promised, would finish what had begun in blood and fire years ago. But that confidence was about to be tested in a way the Kremlin never planned for. It began quietly, as so many turning points do. In early February, amid the chaos of a Starlink communications blackout, Ukrainian search and destroy teams moved into the southeast. Their mission? Clear the gray zone that stretched from Petrovska in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast to Julia in Zaporizhia, an 18-mile strip where Russian infiltrators had dug in, expecting reinforcements that would never arrive. The first real sign of change came in the tiny village of Tanova, population 300 before the war. On February 21st, units from Ukraine's 425th Assault Regiment advanced on entrenched members of Russia's 69th Covering Brigade. The assault was fast, decisive, and left no doubt as to who held the ground afterward. Tanova was no longer a gray zone. It was the first domino in a sequence that Russia could not stop. As news of Tanova's liberation reached the world, Ukraine pushed further. Kalinka, Rizna, Andreka, Nachayka, Ostapska, Nova Zaporizhia. 8 settlements fell in rapid succession, with Russian forces routed or simply vanished. The gray zones evaporated, and with them, the myth of Russian inevitability. What no one in Moscow realized was that the trap had been set weeks earlier. The Starlink shutdown, orchestrated by SpaceX and Elon Musk, had severed Russia's lifeline to real-time battlefield coordination. Russian command centers went dark. Infiltrators behind Ukrainian lines lost contact with their support. Assault groups stumbled, isolated, hoping for rescue that would never come. Compounding the disaster, Putin himself restricted access to Telegram, the last open channel for many frontline units. In the span of days, an army that prided itself on mass had become blind, deaf, and disjointed. Ukraine moved swiftly, exploiting every gap. By February 24th, the commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, reported the liberation of 400 square kilometers, an expanse equal to the footprint of a European city. Months of Russian infiltration were wiped out in 3 weeks. Satellite imagery confirmed 3,000 new Ukrainian artillery strikes in the Tanova direction alone. Defensive lines, anti-tank ditches, and barbed wire returned to Ukrainian control, fortifying the front for the battles to come. What came next would prove that everything analysts assumed about Russia's grip on the southeast was already crumbling beneath their feet. March arrived with the promise of Russian escalation. The spring offensive was supposed to begin. Instead, Ukraine seized the initiative. Reports from the Institute for the Study of War and international press painted a picture of a Russian military forced to defend ground it had thought secure. Ukraine's advances were not random. They targeted weak points exposed by the communication collapse. Drones filled the skies, not just for reconnaissance, but as weapons, inflicting catastrophic losses on Russian armor and infantry. In March alone, 96% of Russian casualties were attributed to drone strikes. Ukraine's industrial ramp-up, with millions of new drones in the pipeline and 120,000 earmarked for delivery from the UK, meant that every day brought new pain for Russian units on the front. The cost asymmetry was staggering. For every $20,000 Russian Shahed drone, Ukraine fielded an interceptor costing as little as $300. For every multi-million-dollar Russian armored vehicle destroyed, Ukraine lost a few $1,000s in drones. The ledger grew more lopsided as Ukrainian tactics evolved. Create kill zones, lure in Russian infantry, and decimate them with remotely piloted swarms. The result was a casualty rate for Russia that outpaced recruitment. By March, Russian military planners faced a shortfall of 65,000 soldiers against annual targets. The math was brutal. More assaults no longer meant more territory. Russian advances slowed to a crawl, 2.5 kilometers per day, down from 13 the year before. Ukrainian recapture rates rose to nearly 5 kilometers per day, almost double Russia's pace. The pendulum kept swinging. As Russia funneled reserves south to counter Ukraine's push, defenses in Donetsk weakened. Each new Ukrainian gain forced Moscow to divert troops, shuffling units back and forth in a desperate attempt to patch holes that only widened. The fortress belt in Donetsk, once the centerpiece of Russian strategy, began to look less like a fortress and more like a liability. Every scrap of liberated ground became a beachhead for further Ukrainian advances. The trap was closing, and Russia's own overextension made escape impossible. It was in this crucible that the real objective emerged. Ukraine's campaign was not simply about territory. It was about erasing Russian influence, de-Russification at the barrel of a gun and the stroke of a policy pen. For every village retaken, Ukrainian flags replaced Russian propaganda. For every pocket cleared, schools resumed teaching in Ukrainian, local councils reinstated, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine reasserted its independence. The campaign was cultural as much as military. Even currency was targeted. The push to eliminate the Russian kopeck from circulation, described by the National Bank's chief as a piece of Moscow in our pockets and in our heads. That single decision, to frame the campaign as a battle for identity as well as land, set off a chain of events that most outside observers had not yet fully mapped, and whose consequences still reverberate beyond Ukraine's borders. Russia tried to adapt. The Kremlin ordered a new mobilization, forcing businesses to provide conscripts in a desperate bid to stem the tide. On the technological front, Russia launched satellites to create a homegrown equivalent of Starlink. But with just 16 in orbit, the system was a shadow of 10,000 plus satellites that SpaceX deployed. Commanders banned Telegram, further isolating troops who were already cut off. The result was not greater cohesion, but growing despair. Reports filtered back from the front, increasing numbers of Russian soldiers taking their own lives rather than face drone swarms in kill zones. The attrition strategy that had sustained Russia for years now worked in reverse. Each attempt to retake lost ground ended in failure and more casualties. The accounting was merciless. By the end of March, Russia had lost 1.3 million soldiers, killed or wounded since the invasion's start. For every square kilometer gained, the toll was 316 Russian lives. For every square mile, nearly 900. Yet in March, for the first time in 2.5 years, Russia made no net territorial gains. Ukraine's advances in the south, over 480 square kilometers retaken in the Alexandrivka sector, 430 in the Durelia counteroffensive, 183 in Kupiansk, reversed months of Russian progress. Oil terminals burned in the Baltic as Ukrainian long-range drones struck deep behind the lines, knocking out 40% of Russia's crude export capacity. Money dried up. Recruitment faltered. The cycle of failure accelerated. The fall summit arrived quietly. Russia announced again that it had conquered the Luhansk region, its third such declaration in as many years. Yet holdout villages remained, and the ISW's analysts noted that even these isolated gains came at the cost of abandoning objectives elsewhere. Plans to take the Donetsk fortress belt were postponed. Buffer zones became no-go zones. The grand offensive, meant to sweep Ukraine from the Donbass by year's end, was already being scaled back to 2027. Ukraine's strategy, meanwhile, grew sharper. The four-part plan, exhaust, hold, build, strike, was executed with precision. Every liberated mile was fortified, every Russian assault funneled into kill zones. Gas reserves were stockpiled for the next winter. Personnel mobilization was reformed to retain more soldiers and improve training. The new Delta command system allowed real-time drone and artillery coordination. Sector-based counterattacks forced Russia to spread its forces thin, exposing yet more weaknesses. Underground tunnels, once small-scale, now served as logistical arteries, moving men and equipment unseen beneath the front. Ukrainian innovation, once reactive, became predictive, striking where Russia was weakest before Moscow even realized the vulnerability. The resonance of these shifts was not confined to the battlefield. Ukraine's defense industry, built under fire, began exporting weapons and expertise. Interceptor drones, electronic warfare systems, even unmanned naval platforms to Gulf states and African allies. Defense agreements with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and bases in Libya signaled a new phase. Ukraine as a security provider, not merely a recipient. In Iran, Ukrainian specialists advised on countering Shahed drones, the same models that had once terrorized Kyiv. The United States, facing a resurgent Iranian threat in the Strait of Hormuz, found itself needing Ukraine's innovations more than ever. The cycle had come full circle, the student now teaching the master. The question worth sitting with is not whether Russia can still win by brute force, but whether the logic of attrition has finally broken in the face of adaptive, networked resistance. What is left for a power whose main weapon, mass, now turns inward, feeding a cycle of loss it cannot escape? How long can a state sustain offensives that yield only exhaustion, as the defender grows stronger and more connected with every month? If you see a deeper pattern here or a parallel in another conflict, share your thought below. The story is not over. Ukraine's push has only just begun. The next moves on both sides will reveal what war in the 21st century really means, when information, innovation, and identity converge on the front lines.